Welcome all to the Politics of Cinema, the show where, you guessed it, cinema and politics go hand in hand. My name is Aaron Spears.
And my name is Isaac Miller. And this episode, we are celebrating this election, which is still on. We're going to talk about this. We were originally
observing. I don't know if celebrating is the right word there.
We are marking.
Marking.
I don't want to use coping because that appears to be what the hashtag for people on the right are dealing with the fact that Trump is probably out of office. I mean,
processing.
We're processing what has been an absurdly stressful week. I mean, mental breakdown level stressful week by talking about the Purge election day, part of the ongoing Purge saga, which now has a TV series. One of the most political, I would say, allegorical series. You know, one of these days we might want to just cover the entire Purge series, just as a whole thing. Political series out there, and it just felt appropriate. But we ended up holding off on it, right? Because we wanted to see how the election sort of turned out.
Well, right, because also we picked this very specifically because of the elements in the movie that are like, well, this feels remarkably prescient. And then also, like, we just didn't want to hit record with, like, it felt like there was going to be a decision, something to, like, kind of add to the, because everything's about cinema, of course, in my brain, to add to the current rereading of the Purge election year as a political text, knowing the outcome of the election. Now it mirrors reality even closer than it did a week ago.
Do you mean the nice liberal is here to save us?
Well, yes and no, because, like, if you remember the end of the Purge election year, spoilers, the anti-Purge candidate wins. It ends with a news report on the TV as Marcos is repainting the deli, in which the news says the NFFA supporters are reacting violently to this defeat, burning cars, breaking windows, looting, and attacking police officers. Then the song "I'm Afraid of Americans" starts playing, and we get the credits.
Good point.
A little close to home.
Wow. So I have to admit,
see.
I have not paid as close attention. I mean, I watched this movie, but normally I would, like, rewatch and do all these things, and I didn't quite do that because it's been a week.
It has been a week.
And all right. Let's yeah.
Well, hold on. Before we get into that, though, let's check in with our genre hunting. Anything you've jumped into genre wise since we last recorded, Isaac?
So I would say that the primary way that I've been coping with this whole situation is watching movies from the 30s that were designed to distract you from the Great Depression. They're still effective. But I'm actually not highlighting that. I'm just teasing that. But basically, my very late night after the election watching was the two Bahubali movies, Indian epics. I think that in Tamil, actually. And
I think so, yeah.
Massive Indian epics from 2015, Bahubali: The Beginning, and I'm saying the name wrong, and they say it many times in the movie, and that is embarrassing. And Bahubali 2, The Conclusion. These are, I'm going to admit, I am not deeply versed in modern Indian film. It's a massive, right? Like, this is the biggest film industry in the world. It's deeply influential.
Yeah.
It's really powerful. But one of the things that hits you watching this is these are better epics than anything in American theaters, basically. Like, they are massive and deeply mythical. And I think one of the advantages that sort of Indian film has in this is because you're going to have song and dance numbers in the middle of this, and because you sort of have to paper with the fact that you don't have CGI budgets that can actually make CGI that's, like, realistic. You don't have to pretend.
Yeah, that fascinates me too in these series.
So they don't have to. Like, everything, you just make everything. And not only what this is a series about basically a young man who is superhumanly strong. Like, it's basically a legend story, like a classic legend story, like a Hercules-like story, right? He is a demigod, functionally, who is finding his way back to his real identity as, spoilers, the king of, a kingdom that's, like, up the mountain that you have to climb up. And, this is all hyper heightened. So basically, the fact that your CGI is just not going to be at Hollywood levels doesn't matter, because you can cover it up with superior production values, set design, costumes, like the real stuff. and then, just utterly epic battles and, whatever. I mean, it's just, it's totally,
Yeah.
it's totally engrossing. I like the first one a lot more than the second. They are designed to just run right into each other. I mean, they were clearly written together. It's not one of those
Oh, like
situations.
timeline. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, like it's all, it's not like we got this one and then we're going to do the next one. It's like this was supposed to be together. In some ways I can't speak to the politics of it because I don't know enough about Indian cinema to know if this lands in a political space.
Right.
Probably does.
Same here.
I feel better about like, Indian action movies that have to do with like national security issues or something like that. I can't figure that out. But like
rather than like the mythology or I see what you're saying. Yeah,
like something that's played off of like as a mythological epic about, like, I mean, the parallel would be a Hercules story or something like that. And that's what
Sure,
this is.
sure.
I can't speak to that, but they're wildly entertaining. It's lots of fun. The action's great. And if you're just trying to, I just want to say cope, not cope as a Trump fan because tough shit. Life is hard.
Right.
But, cope with the fact that this is a very difficult and complicated situation and COVID spiraling out of control. This is a good way to do it.
Absolutely. And we will hit a bit deeper in Indian cinema at some point in the life of the podcast because it's a genre, as I think we mentioned back when we did our second episode on Wolf Warrior 2 and Invasion USA. The level of craftsmanship going into blockbuster epic movies, especially action movies, I think it's arguable that some Chinese films, but a lot of Indian productions I've seen definitely beat the shit out of anything that Hollywood is doing. One, I think if you can do the musical genre is so ingrained in Indian cinema and in Bollywood that like if you can do a great choreographed musical number, you can do a kick-ass fight scene.
Exactly. I think that is
exactly. That doesn't surprise me at all. And they combine them together, which is great because I fucking love musicals. And the fact that they're doing this also because like in America, I've done a deep dive into American musical history just because I've taught a class on it before. There isn't like the action mixed with musicals going on in America.
And that has to do, I think that has to do with types of masculinity and what is allowed and what is not, and what are the demarcation lines between women.
Presumed audience too.
Yeah,
I think they presume, especially in the day and age now we have, like the people going to musicals would be like women dragging their male counterparts or whatever to go see the movie.
Whatever stereotypes we have. Well, that's what I mean. Is that it's a supposed gendered demarcation.
Yeah.
On who is interested and who is not, which actually ends up impoverishing your cinema to a certain degree. Because if you watch wushu, if you watch Hong Kong action, this is dancing.
Yeah.
This is totally dancing.
It's choreography.
When I was part of the thing about watching this is I was thinking like, what is the influence of Hong Kong cinema on Indian action and vice versa? Like, what are the lines of pollination there? Because the action, there's things that look very similar, and I don't know if it's coincidental or not. Yeah, well, we talked briefly about 2019's War.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And I think that's where this sort of came up before, which is a movie where you can ascribe a lot of traditional. The Indian nationalism is very clear, and I could make political comments about that without having deep knowledge of Indian politics.
Right. It's also contemporary too, and it's clearly like Fast and the Furious level, surface barely politics.
Yes.
In those two.
Which means it's actually absurdly political and.
Right. No, I agree.
Yeah. But this is much harder. But yeah, no, God, you're totally right. I mean, it really, the fact that you can have dance numbers, the fact that all of your actors are expected to be in shape enough to do it.
Well, I consider the gender politics, like you're saying too. I think when lockdown first happened back in March for us here in Ohio and in the States, we watched as a family the Doom series, DHOOM, 3 of them, Indian action films. And at one point, my partner Kelly, she was like, "Oh my God, every Indian actor and actress, whatever, in these movies is a Beyonce. They're solid actors, they're solid dancers, and they got the whole package." And I was like, "You have to in Bollywood because like you're expected, like you said, to be able to." It stands out when you have someone who's in there just to be like usually it's a guy, like the beefcake action star, can't really dance too much. I'm looking at you, Salman Khan. The rest of them, like they are astounding. Like, and the musical numbers, especially, well, let's go back to War. Like the musical number in that one where there's like a temple on the edge of a cliff and they're all throwing around colored dye. Like,
oh, that's absurd.
It's absurd, but it's a kick-ass music video and it feels totally a place within this one. And then they go right on to like crazy action set pieces that would like make John Woo drop his jaw back in the 90s.
I mean, this
They're crazy.
probably doesn't have, I think it has standout scenes. I don't think they're like, it's the most amazing dancing I've ever seen, but they're certainly, I think they're competent. I think, part of what it has is like Lord of the Rings scale epic battles, which you can sometimes see the CGI sort of, there's actually one thing at the end where it's just like, ooh, that's pretty clunky. But basically you're able to avoid it pretty effectively. It's also like one of these, like part of it is it's also like totally a superhero movie because basically you have multiple characters who are, well, there's sort of like, if you take sort of a wushu aesthetic plus superheroes, you sort of get this, right? Because the highest level warriors are basically superhuman. Like they can lift things. They can, they can do this stuff. They can do, and there's at least one other warrior who's not like one of these brothers and their son, who also is at that level, right? He picks up a giant door. Why? Because he's the best warrior, and that's just what you expect, right? Which is sort of like when you're watching, something in the line of, let's say, Hero or something. These aren't things that human beings can do, but within this universe, if you're a top level warrior, and so that's the other where it's just like, and it's not questioned. I mean, they're actually amazing in this, right? They're considered amazing within this universe, but it's also like it's within the realm. So
right.
Well, there we go. We got a political angle on this. Is like your action is better when you have. I'm not saying that Indian culture is less patriarchal than the United States. I think it's certainly is, but the patriarchal lines are different, and what is machismo is different, and in a way that serves their cinema better.
Or can. I'm sure there's some pretty horrible shit out there that we're just not seeing yet.
Yep, that's true.
They're putting out more movies per year than Hollywood, and I'm probably only watching like 10 to 15 Bollywood movies a year, so I don't have a very good idea of what the scope is there. Also, it's another one of those things where like it's a foreign language market that like we're not. I mean, the number of films put out by the country of India per year versus what actually gets its way to our eyeballs here in the States is a very small percentage, I would imagine.
I've always wondered that about Korean film because it seems like everything we see is at such an absurdly high level.
Right. Well, that opens up a larger conversation too of I called it, just because I was working at an art house theater for over a decade when Amélie first came out from France. It was like this Amélie effect where the only movies we were getting from France for the longest time were like these whimsical romantic comedies or romantic dramas. I was like, they make action movies in France. Why aren't we getting any of those? Well, Amélie made buckets of money. Mm-hmm. So that's what you're getting here for the longest time. Eventually you get, District B13, stuff like that actually was like, oh, good. Yes, you are making action films. Can I please have one of them every once in a while? But that's also, I think it's foreign language film distributors in America, like they see what the trends are. So like you said, with Korean cinema, it seems like it's going to be for a while, which I'm perfectly fine with because they're amazing films. It's all in the wake of Bong Joon-ho, and Parasite is going to lead what gets theatrically, if that's even going to be a thing, released in America from South Korea for a while.
Right. But I do have a feeling that the level of quality in South Korean films that we're getting is not
just better.
It's just not accidental. It's
right.
Industry wide.
It's there. Yeah. I went in a different direction, but it does actually feature music. So I guess that's really the only segue I would have to the genre. I kind of took a look at, not really on purpose, but I just saw that this movie was finally up streaming on Canopy. I think it's on Amazon as well. It's from 2017. Didn't end up playing at the Art House Theater when I was still there. I was really pushing for it because I wanted to see it really bad. It's called Turn It Around, the story of East Bay punk.
To those who live it, punk rock is something more. It is a conversation with society.
San Francisco, I think at one point it's probably the strongest scene in America.
All of a sudden, like all these bands just start popping up.
The bands that we were excited about were our East Bay bands.
It had an important place in the pantheon of punk. It was about playing honest music.
Like, it wasn't hard like punk rock was supposed to be.
It wasn't always about the band that was playing on stage. It was equally about what was happening in the audience.
A punk rock club opened up in my neighborhood. I jumped on a bus the next day and I headed back home.
People remember it as being a starting point to the East Bay scene.
Gilman Street, you had a co-op. You didn't have any of that in L.A. Nobody trusted anybody.
was a great hub for all the bands to go to.
This was what was going to be it for another generation.
Silly string everywhere in the room.
It was just a lot of mocking, and I was just like, this place sounds pretty rad.
Punk was getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
It's an underground punk scene. It's meant to thrive in this environment.
You know, when I stop and think about it now, it was a precious time.
People can create their own culture. You don't have to wait. You can say, hey, I got something to say, and I'm going to say it.
And the genre in this case, I think, I feel like we've mentioned this before on the show, maybe not. Working at the Art House Theater, Isaac, for the time you were there and I was there were these niche musical documentaries that always did gangbusters business. And I don't know if it was because you would expect them to not really have a wider audience, and then it would surprise you when they were out for that specific band or musician. But I always found it really interesting. Like, we had Once Were Brothers, Robbie Robertson and the band. So it was just the story of the band. Or there was a Linda Ronstadt documentary, I think from last year, possibly. The Laurel Canyon documentary.
We had a flood of, I don't want to say baby boomer, but yes, that's totally baby boomer nostalgia movies. And I think it's kept up. I think there's more. Not that there's anything wrong with it. It's usually about very good music. No. The Linda Ronstadt one, I mean, I really didn't. What was so interesting was she's such a massive figure who actually, like, people in my generation actually basically, what was interesting was the staff, like, nobody in the staff knew anything about her.
Right, not even by name. It was just like, who?
Yeah, like, I knew the name. And then I actually saw it with my aunt, and it was like, oh.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. They're good because it's not, like, Laurel Canyon stuck in my head specifically in this case because Laurel Canyon took a look at one specific geographic area and the bands that were active in it. And that one was quite a hit. And it allows it to get a deeper dive into a certain style of music or a certain few bands, that sort of thing, rather than just like a big broad, like, this isn't a documentary, the one, Turn It Around. This isn't a documentary on like 80s and 90s punk music. I mean, it is, but it's about specifically the East Bay area. And since we just did our whole series on the 1960s, and there was a focus a little bit off and on kind of the Haight-Ashbury community in San Francisco specifically, but then also knowing like how active San Francisco currently is politically, but also even within narrative films. Like a future episode we're working on is sort of what's going on in the Bay Area right now with filmmaking. When you have Last Black Man in San Francisco and Sorry to Bother You, and like Ryan Coogler comes out of there, like there's something just interesting about this geographical area and what they're doing as far as different artistic movements go, and also how politically active they are at the same time. But this one too, though, this particular one, Turn It Around, the story of East Bay punk, is so specific. It even focuses in on like one specific venue on Gilman Street that like was collectively run by kids basically as well, because that one guy even comments on how at that point in time in the 80s and 90s, punk was like being performed at like 21 and over clubs, but like there was a whole youth movement behind it that like couldn't get in because they weren't 21. And it wasn't even because like they wanted to drink. Granted, there's teenage alcoholics in this movie, but it wasn't about just I wanted to get in and drink. But like if you couldn't pay to get in, you'd say like, well, I'll stick around and help clean up. And then like, okay, fine, come on in. And then you'd stick around and help clean up. And there was just such a sense of community there. It's really interesting because it does a deep dive into this area. For people that aren't familiar with it, the most, I guess you would say, famous bands that came out of it would be like Operation Ivy, Green Day, Rancid, those particular bands.
Well, that's not small.
That's not small at all. And it goes into a deeper dive. It gets into like gender politics. It gets into like racial politics because like the Beatniks were coming out of there and the Yeasty Girls and all these bands are just like, oh my, like as it was popping up, I was like, this is when I got into punk music in the early 90s. So the best parallel would be if you had a documentary about grunge coming out of Seattle. That's a great documentary. And that's was like when I first started getting into music that was outside of my parents' taste at that point in my life. I got into grunge because I was, the right age as a teen to get into that. And then punk hit. I was like, oh my God, that's what I was waiting for. That just hit like a ton of bricks. So that's what this movie is. It's documenting the birth of that kind of, I guess you could argue it more like pop punk and radio punk coming out of that area, the way that, grunge came out of Seattle. But I think it does a good job. I couldn't tell you this because like as bands were popping up and I was like, oh my God, I used to own that cassette tape. Oh my God, I had that zine. I think it does a pretty good job because it's 2 hours and 35 minutes long of giving everybody context to why it was important and what it was doing. So I don't think it's one of those like too in the weeds that if you've never heard of any of those bands that you wouldn't enjoy it. I think it does a pretty good job of showing what like a musical collective can do. And also, I found it really good. There was a lot of documentation, and there's tons of interviews with people that were in bands. It was like a lot of archival footage, a lot of photographs, a lot of old recordings of how bands function together to create a music scene and not to compete with each other to see who can get a record deal. Like it was about supporting each other and creating a space where you could come in and perform. At one point in this movie, Miranda July shows up and does a play at this venue that's been pretty much showing like punk music, punk bands playing. And she's like, welcome to the open arms. And everyone's like, holy shit, that was amazing. Because it's just like, it's a space to be creative and, you know, stick it to the man, essentially.
I need to watch it because I am one of those weird lefties of my age cohort, which is early to mid 30s, that didn't go through a punk phase, basically.
Oh, you said did not?
Yeah. I mean, it's not that I haven't listened to a lot. I just never really, oh God, should I be saying this on a podcast? Like I never really connected to things through music. I listened to music, but music wasn't sort of a self-identifier thing in terms of scenes.
That makes sense though. Yeah.
No, it's weird and cuts you off from popular culture in bizarre ways and makes you feel isolated and alone. But,
hey, but you know what? That's exactly how everybody was talking about how they felt when they found the punk scene in East Bay.
There we go. There you go. Maybe I need to time travel through this and just rewrite my personal history and just pretend that it wasn't the case.
Well, it also, it's a great refresher too, because I think as we go through waves of, I don't know if it'd be like generational or like waves of decade nostalgia. Like I feel like, as we mentioned with our art house horror series, one of the things I was looking at this October was the wave of 80s nostalgia in horror films that are being done now.
Mm-hmm.
And at a certain point, we're going to move into 90s nostalgia if we haven't already. And actually, I mean, also just being a young adult librarian, some of the books that I'm reading that are coming out, there are some things that are set in the 90s, and there's some vague talk of like, oh, just it was, you know, it's kind of racist, it's pretty sexist. Like, well, that's probably maybe true on a general big cultural level, but that's addressed head on in this particular movie too, where like these kids, because they're pretty much, you know, under 18 in like the 80s that are creating this scene here and creating these bands, like one of the hallmarks of like coming to Gilman Street was like no sexism, no racism. There's even a whole segment about like skinheads fucking with punks. And at one point they just grabbed a bunch of bats and beat the shit out of these skinheads, and they never messed with the punk scene again because they were, you know, racist and sexist assholes trying to fuck with their scene. And so it's also like, oh, that's how I remember my experience in the 90s was like me and my theater geek friends in high school. Like people weren't like sexist and homophobic. Like we were pretty, you know, we were open and supportive because like that's all we got.
Well, I mean, that's part of it is that a lot of, you could say that a lot of this sort of, I mean, yeah, these fights, sort of the culture war fights that we talk about now, but also the anti-racist and feminist fights that, yeah, these things have been going on for a long time. It's these period, you know, there was, none of this stuff was not contested. It wasn't, when you're watching movies, for instance, from these periods, it's not contested there.
Right.
That's not true. There's plenty of anti-race. I mean, the 90s, we should talk about the 90s for race and film, which would be an interesting discussion.
That's true.
And black cinema in the 90s. But it's, it's sort of, I think a lot of people just, you're not going to, I mean, we're a movie podcast and you're actually not going to see a lot of these fights in mainstream movies. It's when you go back and, you know, because you're just going back and watching Back to the Future and going like, oh my God, as opposed to sort of seeing where probably a lot of the same fights that we're having now, except that we're winning more of them, were had then.
Yeah, for sure. Also, just because I got to stand up for Back to the Future, that's mostly set in the 50s.
Well, but it's an 80s view of the 50s.
No, I know. All right. Should we jump into The Purge?
Let's talk about The Purge.
So for our feature presentation today, we wanted to jump into the Purge universe. I kind of spearheaded this one saying I think we should look at the Purge election year. One, because I adore Frank Grillo, and I know you do as well. And granted, the logical thing would be like, well, let's do the Purge Anarchy then, because that's the first time the Frank Grillo character pops up in this franchise. But the Purge election year is about an election year, and we're in an election year. So we went with thematically like, well, let's just do this one instead. So
right,
we are jumping into the Purge election year, but I think we'll have a little bit of commentary on some of the other ones in this series as well. But for the basic premise of this conversation, folks, in the Purge election year, we are in America in 2040. Former police sergeant Barnes becomes head of security for Senator Charlie Roan, a presidential candidate targeted for death on Purge night because she wants to eliminate the Purge when she becomes president.
The soul of our country is at stake. The Purge targets the poor and the innocent.
The senator's going to win, and she's going to make real changes, too.
It is a night that is defining our country.
It's time to do something about that, Senator.
The Purge has to come to an end.
You take a lot of risks, Senator.
I have to. I was the only one in my family to survive. What made you apply for this position?
I almost did something on Purge night some years back. I want this night gone.
I want men in all these rooms. We got eyes and ears on everything.
All right, let's begin.
This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual Purge. At the siren, all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 hours. Your government thanks you for your participation.
Someone betrayed us. This is not a drill. We are on our own. We have one goal right now. Survival.
Should we lay out a little more of the, as the series has gone on? I don't know, in the first one, which I've actually never seen, did they lay out the new founding fathers and the whole premise?
Yeah, so in the first one, it's pretty much a title on screen, just saying that, in 2014, the new founding fathers of America, totalitarian political party, are voted into office following economic collapse. They pass a law that sanctions an annual purge for 12 hours each year, blah, like the usual stuff, like that announcement that comes in every Purge movie. All crime is legal during this time period, except government officials, and emergency services will be unavailable until 7 a.m. tomorrow. So then the premise, even with the first one, is that unemployment has dropped to 1%. The United States is virtually crime-free, presumably because the Purge happens. And it all ends with, blessed be the new founding fathers for letting us purge and cleanse our souls.
Right.
Blessed be America, a nation reborn.
So the premise of this is that there is a night in which you are able to go out and kill or commit any crime that you want. But, the underlying, theory behind the new founding fathers is that we're getting rid of undesirables, which are basically poor people, people of color, and so forth, in order to, the way that in the movie, the way that the economics of this is explained is you're getting rid of the disposable population because you're getting rid of the disposable population to keep down welfare costs, basically.
Right.
Now,
so, even in this particular movie, there's the scene towards the beginning where the new founding fathers are watching the debate that Charlie has with the guy who's running for president. And he actually says, they want the impossible, everyone to have.
Yes. Now, I'm actually going to go at the economics of this real quick.
Sure.
From a capitalist perspective, from a sort of neoliberal capitalist or any capitalist perspective, this doesn't make any damn sense. Because what this actually is doing is tightening the labor market, which means you're giving bargaining power to workers because you're getting rid of the excess labor supply. This is, so basically, this is Marx's reserve army of labor, right? Or what is oftentimes called relative surplus population. And basically getting rid of that is actually, it's just strengthening the bargaining power of the remaining workers. It's why after the Black Death, most economic historians would, basically in Europe, the effect of the Black Death is different in other parts of the world. In the 13th or in the 14th century, wages, which most people don't work for wages, but relative bargaining power of peasants and urban workers goes up exponentially. So this doesn't actually make a hell of a lot of sense.
Economically speaking.
Nonetheless, politically, I think the Purge is one of the best products. The Purge series is one of the best products of the Obama years in terms of getting across. I think if this is reacting to anything, it's reacting to the Tea Party movement originally, or the Tea Party moment originally, and moving from there as things move along. This is from 2016. So part of what was interesting about watching it is we're right on the cusp of Trump, but we're not there yet. So it's reflecting a view of the right pre-Trump.
Well, he was still a candidate.
He was still a candidate. That's true.
And running. So like the hints were there. Yeah. No, the timeline, I looked these up, rewatching them this time because this was the first time watching the Purge election year where I looking up going like, wait, this is set in 2040? Because there's no gadgetry. You know what I mean? Like it's set in 2040. So you'd assume there'd be like a different style of car. Like it looks essentially like it's now.
Yeah.
Like it's which was interesting. I know it's like, lower budget or whatever, but the Blumhouse rules of like, they're not going to, just because it's a successful series, Blumhouse doesn't follow the usual Hollywood rules of like, oh, it's the third one in a successful series. Let's go 80 million on this budget. It's still, kept, within some realm of like common sense budgeting, I guess you could say. But like even the first one, the original one, just The Purge, that's set in 2022. And there's a bit more gadgetry within the car that Ethan Hawke drives and the house they live in. And there's a whole separate political read to that movie where, the neighborhood turns on them because he's exploiting their fears to make money and blah, whatever. Mm. But then, so you've got The Purge, the original one, 2022, The Purge Anarchy, 2023. The Purge election year is set in 2040. And then the first Purge is set in 2017. And the first Purge is the only one that's been made while Trump was in office. And that one is just very not on the nose. Like it's not hiding it at all. Like this is what we're doing now. Let's hit the fucking gas pedal.
Wait a second. So Frank Grillo is supposed to be 17 years older in this movie?
That's a good point too.
Is this the same? Are you sure that timeline's right? Is this the same character?
Yeah, I grabbed him like from the movies as I was watching them. It's the same character, yeah.
Well,
so yeah, I think we found our first big loophole in the logic here. Well, no, second one. So the economics don't work, and Frank Grillo does not age. So he's got some sort of super soldier serum going, which maybe ties him into the, Marvel universe where he also has a character. Yeah, that is weird. So like, cause the Purge election year starts off in 2022 when Charlie's family is murdered by a purger and she's still wearing the same glasses. That's how you know it's her. And then cuts to immediately, like 23 years later, still wearing the same glasses. Now she's a senator trying to stop the purge. And Frank Grillo from The Purge Anarchy, where he is a mourning father out for revenge and realizes, oh, maybe this isn't a great idea, has now not aged and become the head of security for the senator.
Right. Where I'm trying to remember in The Purge Anarchy, I mean, he's an ex-cop. Is he supposed to be anything else other than that? Because his like commando level skills.
Yeah, no, just badass ex-cop.
Okay.
So the first thing to start off with here is this new founding fathers of America idea, because I find it really interesting the way that they've woven this through the entire series so far. They're just a title on screen and the emergency broadcast system in the first Purge. Sorry, in The Purge, which is the first movie in the series. I keep wanting to say the first Purge, meaning like the Ethan Hawke one from that started the whole series, but that's actually the name of the most recent one. So in that one, they're just this like on-screen, we're the government, Big Brother kind of style thing. Whereas in the Purge Anarchy and the Purge election year, you actually get some characters from within this government.
Well, we get a view of the top of this government, and I think we get a good sense of them ideologically. And despite me going after the economic logic of this, which admittedly, in the face of an economic collapse, some things can change. But part of what's interesting about the world building here is that whatever sort of incoherences we find, the politics are actually, I think, pretty coherent. Because what you're dealing with is basically a more or less white supremacist religious cult. Basically, basically what you're dealing with is like a far right version of Christianity, which has been combined with murdering poor people as opposed to just like wealth theology, combined with hyper capitalism, in which people are just sort of left to die, which is sort of what the allegory of the Purge is, right? Is what capitalism does to us, in which we're just competing with each other, we're destroying each other instead of uniting.
Oh my God, hold on! It's also the A Christmas Carol Ebenezer Scrooge argument. Then they should die and decrease the surplus population when he's yelling at the folks coming by at the start of the story asking for a handout to help feed the poor this holiday season.
Yeah. Well, Malthusianism is a big thing in the 19th century as much as it is today.
Yeah.
So like, but right. I mean, it's like, this is what capitalism does to us. And part of what what the Purge, in which the most vulnerable population is the poorest and oftentimes the most marginalized in especially racial terms, which the Purge films are very careful to point out very openly, are the ones who are forced to compete and die, or are targeted the most for sport or most dehumanized.
Yeah.
But part of the other thing at the sort of allegorical level that the Purge makes very clear is this is something that has to be artificially created, which is true under capitalism as a system, right? Our competitive, the way our competitive drives against each other, the way that capitalism forces everybody to compete against each other is framed is that it is a naturalized thing that we all inherently do. And in fact, that's a social system that has to be carefully created. And the Purge movies, and this one especially, directly go after that.
You also, I don't think you've seen it, but that is literally the plot that they jump into in the first Purge, which is the most recent movie. When you see like how the first Purge happens, they send out white supremacist like death squads, government troops at this point, to make sure it happens because it's not happening.
Right, because nobody actually wants to do this.
Right. Well, there's one like completely like wildly mental unstable drug addict named Skeletor, who's like, this like, African-American like boogeyman character that runs around. He's enjoying himself, but it's not kicking off the Purge the way they want it to. Also, it's isolated to like Staten Island, I think, or some specific neighborhood in New York City. But like the evil government character in that one is the one who's like making sure the troops are on the streets, they're executing people, they're like clearing out, low-income housing development. And, the neighborhood assembles and fights back. But it's like, no, like you said, like they are actively creating it in the first Purge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just it. I mean, I think in the Purge Anarchy, you see it less in this. Like the government is openly, that actually, I mean, what you're talking about I think this happens in the Purge Anarchy where the government is openly doing this under the cover of the Purge because not enough people are doing it. I mean, in this, one of the things, I mean, we sort of talk about sort of the balance between the politics of the film, which is disapproving of the Purge and making a political critique at the same time that obviously, like many horror movies, and this is always the dichotomy that you have, where also this is what people are going to the movie to see, right? You're going to see, teenagers in death masks and, in blood-splattered ballerina costumes going out to murder their parents and anyone else who gets in their way because they don't give them candy. Like that.
Yeah, you need the gore set pieces.
Right. So like it's, and of course they can do their social commentary through that. The costumes are great, but it is like, I actually think it works for the Purge movies because these connect so much to the world that we're living in, right? It feels so much like, I mean, think about this in the COVID year, right? Where basically if you're a service worker, you're fucked. If you're a factory worker, you're fucked. Who lives and who dies. So like, if anything, the Purge movies and the mentality behind them, the mentality of, the potentially, hopefully, we're going to finally finish this off, outgoing Trump administration around how we handle the economy as a maw that we have to feed, right? Suffering. Yeah, these movies fit, and this one gets it across really, really well.
I think so too. There's one more thing on the new Founding Fathers of America I wanted to mention before we get to as I put in my notes, the candy brats that kind of encapsulate Act 1 of this movie. I lifted a couple phrases actually, Isaac, from a fascism presentation you did for DSA about a couple of them just rang true where I was like, oh my God, that's the Purge right there. One of them was the like classic authoritarian vibes were a controlling regime that justifies itself to the people as a necessary evil, uniquely capable of coping with easily recognizable societal problems.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, that's the new Founding Fathers, right? Like that's literally what they invented in this fictional universe to maintain their control on society. So you've got some classic authoritarianism, check. And then you had a comment too on like fascism being a popularization of belief that the nation must be saved or purified.
Yes.
Elevates the need for national rebirth to a virtual religion. I was like, holy shit, that's the Purge also. It's like, as unsubtle as the movie actually is, there's like some underlying stuff where I was like, wow, yeah, no, there's some pure expression of terrifying political ideologies going on here too.
Well, that are dead on. And a part of it is is that, yes, it's on the nose, but it's right on the nose. It's one of these things where it's not over the top. I mean, it is over the top. I don't think this is actually what we would see happening under any circumstances. But it's not in this way because it's not the most like effective or realistic way to exactly do this sort of thing. But
well, it's over the top because it's hitting some genre beats, like we said.
Right.
But at the same time, like the underlying idea that's propelling it into these genre beats is scary and solid.
Well, it's a real image of a 21st century fascism where you have authoritarian, but it's not totalitarian in the sense that they have complete control, right? The founding fathers can actually lose an election, hypothetically, which they do.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, it's, deeply authoritarian. I mean, is it any more absurd than, Nazi death camps or whatever? No. And is it? Yeah. And I think, gosh, that you're right. This is the language of purifying the nation. This is not an accident, right?
No, it was like very, very striking. So you've got a few, you've got a menagerie of characters here. So you got Frank Grillo as the security agent for Charlie, Senator Charlene technically, but she goes by Charlie. Then you've also got the small business owner here. You've got the working class deli owner, Joe Dixon, played by Michael T. Williams. You've got his right-hand man, Marcos, who's his employee's close friend. Does he say where he says he comes from? Juarez, right?
I thought Mexico City. No, I can't remember. Basically, yeah.
But yeah, so because he mentions about how like, every day was a war zone in Juarez or wherever he came from. So like it's after he shows that he's really handy with a rifle. And then Joe looks at him, he's like, damn, I didn't know that. And he's like, well, we had to fight for my life where I came from. That's why I came here. So you're like, okay, you're trained, ready to go. And then you also have Laney, who's a trained triage EMT, formerly La Pequeña Muerte, the infamous purger. So we know that they all have, they're capable of self-defense violence, if not actively been violent in the past. And then the opposite end here that you have on the government side, you've got, this guy just sounds like a metal character to me, Earl Danziger. Maybe it's because it has Danzig kind of in his last name there. He is the leader of the neo-Nazi paramilitary group that literally has a patch that says like, white power on his army fatigues.
Yeah, no, they're basically openly mercenaries working, like white nationalist mercenaries working for the government.
Yeah. And then, like we said, with the NFAA affiliated presidential candidate here, it's Minister Owens. So like he's, like you said, it's a perfect tying together of just like toxic, like religious cult via political ideology now too. That man, there's some scenery to be chewed for him. And it's pretty spectacularly hilarious. I think. So, sticking though with this idea, the candy brats. So Joe's got this deli and there's these local teens. I wanted to say millennials, but I don't know what they would be called because this is 20. What do we say? This was like 20.
This is 2040.
It's an entitled generation that she even like, they come back and it's the first big set piece that you get with Joe is like, they want to break in and get the candy bar she tried to steal and got busted for earlier. And now it's purge night. So she can get her revenge because, he called her out and she was embarrassed or whatever. So you have this like entitled generation that she's screaming with a, I don't know guns that well, like a bedazzled, AR-15 or something that I get to purge tonight. And I was thinking this generation, because the purge has been going on in this particular movie's universe for like 22, 23 years at this point. This is a generation that's only grown up knowing the purge.
They've only grown up knowing the purge. I mean, I think, part of what it is, a lot of what this movie is portraying, is the ways that is societal breakdown, right? The ways that it breaks relationships. Literally the leading one of the brats says that I've just purged my parents and now I'm coming for you so I can get my candy.
Yeah.
And it's so like part of it is that it's, it's something that corrupts everyone because the temptation is always there. Mm-hmm. And it's it causes, because the purge ideology is that this helps to purge us of our sins or allows us to get things out by killing your husband who you don't like or whatever. That's one of the examples in the movie.
It is, yeah.
I think one of the ways that the movie shows people the ways it brings out these urges that people have that the purge ideology says is natural, but actually are breaking people down and completely are unsatisfying. And yet there is like something that they, it's something they've been sort of directed into. And it's a horrific freedom, right?
Yeah.
That like destroys the people who take part in it.
Well, that's sort of the interesting central, I guess you call it, philosophical question there too, where like people are there to watch the movie kind of in a meta sense. You're there to watch the movie because like there's the promise of like some gore set pieces, which we talked about earlier. You know, you look down the alleyway while you're out driving around and you see a guillotine in use. At one point, Lainey, she's driving around like this kind of EMT van, not kind of, it's an actual EMT van on Purge night, helping out people that need help. She even mentions that they did help out a woman who killed her husband and was like, but the new founding fathers of America told me if I purged, like I'd feel better, and I don't. I feel horrible.
That was actually the scene I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah. There is like this condemnation of it within the moral center of these films, which are the characters that aren't purging. But then that's what like the philosophical question is like, aren't they purging though? Because like they're still killing people in self-defense.
Well,
they feel a lot better by the end because they took out, a whole bunch of new founding fathers of America and purgers. But I think that speaks to maybe like the conflict it creates within the audience's mind too.
Well, they're in this situation. I mean, there's a political argument about the uses of political violence and not. Because part of what, so basically Charlie, our presidential candidate, with the help of Frank Grillo's character, they're betrayed and hunted down by this militia. They hook up with the guys at the convenience store and then the MT, and then to basically through that they connect to basically the main resistance, right?
Oh, Dante Bishop, yeah, the resistance there.
So they meet up with the main resistance, and then our politician, Charlie is basically, their plan is one of the things that Charlie putting pressure on the founding fathers, basically pointing out there's a hypocrisy around who gets killed, because of course government officials and the rich can defend themselves, but the poor people can't. Is now they've lifted restrictions on government officials, right? Of course, they have the Secret Service to protect them.
Sure.
So they're going to take this opportunity because you can legally assassinate the entire leadership of this party, which is what they're going to do. And she's arguing with Bishop that basically you cannot do this because this will make them martyrs, and you're using their same methods against them.
Yeah.
And there's a real debate to be had here. I mean,
even though it's legal right now.
It's legal. So it's not, the issue is not legality, but it's their legality, right?
Right.
The legality that you're arguing against, and you're all fighting against the purge on this basis, and yet you're going to use the purge to use political violence. But the other argument is you're dealing with an authoritarian regime which is trying to kill you. You may not make it through the night. You're assuming that this is going to work out. You may just have to take them out, which is a perfectly reasonable political argument, frankly.
Yeah.
And I guess they do both, because they kill off a large portion of the leadership and then don't kill Mr. Owen.
Right. I find this part really interesting in the plot as well, because she's saying like, you can't do this, and she's very much against it. So it establishes her as like, she's sticking with her own morals no matter what. But then she also, that's before she gets kidnapped. So the idea the new founding fathers of America have is they send out the white supremacist Nazi death squads to kidnap her. And like you said, the main leader, even Danziger, he even says like, we need her alive because she's going to be one of the people that they purge
as part of
the new founding fathers of America, as part of their cleansing ceremony or whatever, which is a great bit of scenery chewing.
By the Purge Mass.
Yeah, the Purge Mass. And like it's there, and it's all like, again, I didn't do a freeze frame, but it's like it's all white women and men, mostly men, and they're all gathered there, and all the new founding fathers are going to come up on stage, and they all get to kill their actual political opponent in like in a Purge Mass.
Yes.
Release the violence from your darkened heart. Scour your soul. Let the light in. You are blood baptized, and you are born again. His light entered your heart, Herman. The power of purging! Purge and purify!
So she's clearly like, I'm against this. We don't need to do this. I need to win outright. We don't need them dead. We don't want to make them martyrs, which is arguably that they're going to make her a martyr if they end up getting away with it. But so she's dead set against it. And Frank Grillo's there. He's got her back, but then she gets kidnapped. And unless they had this kind of, the Purge resistance fighters through Dante Bishop and his organization, unless they had them there and had that plan ready, she doesn't get saved.
Yes. Oh, no.
So like she's only saved. At one point, Frank Grillo, even when he arrives, he was like, this just went from an assassination mission to a rescue mission.
And, part of it is you may be crippling their operation. Certainly the fact that they're doing this, we don't know if it's public. Like, they don't really explain that at the end of the movie, that this is what's happened, that they tried to kill her, but that may be the reason she wins. I mean, in terms of a political argument, the 2020 self is a little bit like you're on Bishop's side, right? It's a very sort of liberal argument, let the system work. And whereas the other side is like, we will use the institutions of the system that we control to kill you. How, speaking of parallels, right?
Right.
Where if your best resistance is sort of like weak need liberalism, which will then, this is not actually, but you can't take this too far because Charlie seems actually like she's perfectly fine, and getting rid of the Purge is perfectly reasonable. And
yeah, it's almost like a politically inarguable position to take.
Well, it's positioned that way. Like, that isn't supposed to have any ambiguity. She's not Joe Biden.
Right.
We're not going to be dealing with like neoliberal bullshit.
Right.
But it is like, like, who's right here? Well, like you're saying, like, if Bishop was not doing what he was doing, then her entire framework would have completely collapsed in on herself when they kill her.
Yeah. And they would have presumably won then, because there's also no anti-Purge candidate anymore. She's gone.
Right. And solidify their control unless that leads to civil unrest and breakdown, which is...
Yeah. Well, so then, which I think creates an interesting commentary between that and then the Laney character doing basically, like street medic work out on Purge night. And she even mentions that there's like kind of an unwritten rule that like you don't attack, the medics, the volunteer, like basically community EMS groups that are out there helping out people that need help on Purge night. I feel like there's an interesting commentary within this narrative on community organizing and mutual aid, and how citizens and neighbors like step up to take care of each other.
Yeah. That this is
in times of crisis.
That this is going to happen. And in a lot of ways, this is the sort of very intentional organic organizing that actually keeps communities going.
Yeah.
In a system in which they're abandoned by the official state.
Right. Which is also very front and center in the last Purge, which I think is actually the most, it's definitely the most overtly political of a series of films that are very overtly political already. But I think it's also because that's the only one that's been made in the Trump era, and it's clearly reacting to very specific policies and tendencies.
Well, this is a series where, I think we talked about this when we talked about the 60s. It's something I harped on and never got quite right. But these are movies where in the first, sort of even before BLM, the impact of Occupy to a certain degree, and then very much BLM, is felt in the themes of these films.
Yeah.
These are movies that come out in a period of heightened social movement activity, and even though those social movements are not directly in the film, their analogs are there.
Yeah.
And are the heroes.
Right. Well, because like you're saying, most of these came out during Obama's term and seem to be commentary on like the right-wing swing of like Tea Party and the Republican Party in general.
It's kind of a reminder that the right was winning through a lot of the Obama years.
Yeah.
Well, not to jump into an actual political discussion of what's going on, but there's a consistent continuity from 2010 to now in terms of Republican wins in Congress. That isn't really connected to Trump. Totally off subject. We'll probably talk about that in a moment. But I think, I think you can feel the continuity of both the right and sort of the resistance to it in these films. And you can, I think the sort of portrayal of organic attempts to resist this. And I think, the other thing about this that's interesting is the soft authoritarianism, the legal authoritarianism. This is not a government that is all powerful, but it is controlling, which is a lot of what a lot of the world has been going through. So the sort of neo-fascist wave globally is not out and out dictatorships. It's like pseudo dictatorships. And the new founding fathers are that, right? They're a controlling oligarchy which have reshaped the government to their needs, but they're not all powerful. There's cracks in that armor.
Yeah.
And there's formal liberal democracy, despite the fact that you have a system based on murdering poor people en masse. It's interesting that that's juxtaposed and can actually be shown in the film. I don't know if the filmmakers are aware that's the dynamic they're showing, but you can see it.
I would say, is this one of those just where you're accidentally capturing the zeitgeist?
Well, part of it is that there's openly nationalist iconography in the film, right?
Yeah.
In the sense of in the sense of sort of, so, this is where a little bit of the critique comes out, is like there's still the only alternative idea. These are movies which take some of the perspective and even some of the forms shown in the film from radical movements without getting to the full depths of the critique, right? Which would be, I'm trying to remember, is there a point where you actually see sort of like the American flag? And I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, in the last scene, like Marcos is fixing up the deli because Joe doesn't make it. And so Marcos is in charge of the deli now. He looks out the window and he sees an American flag while he hears about the NFFA supporters reacting violently to the electoral defeat.
So I guess my question is there sort of, so liberal nationalism is sort of your melting pot incorporating immigrants in, instead of challenging the entire historical narrative of American history in which the original founding fathers are, sainted or whatever, you sort of talk about the flaws, you admit the flaws, but it's in continuous arc till progress. And Barack Obama is the most effective modern sort of like propagator of this narrative, which is sort of a post-civil rights narrative of American nationalism. Like, nationalism is about telling stories about who we are.
Right.
It's bullshit and is enabling, right, and is ultimately still based on white supremacy by aligning the degree to which it is completely incorporated into what America has always been. There isn't a perfectibility here.
Right. Well, I mean, even wasn't there like it's a post-racial America now that Obama was president? Like, that was a narrative for a minute.
Yeah.
After he was elected.
That was a huge narrative, and before and after, which, that didn't work out very well. So to the degree to which this film is able to even the question is to the degree to which it's overcoming that, or the degree to which it's still playing into, now he's an immigrant small business owner, right? Like, he can make it in America.
Right.
America can make it, and what we want is back to a normalcy that clearly didn't work. Is that what the movie is saying, or I don't know.
A little close to home.
Well, we are potentially in that moment.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Well, especially knowing the outcome of the current real world election mirrored against the plot of this one and the way that it ends with, like you clearly cut away from Marcos, like getting the American dream back on its feet, literally in the deli, doing a new coat of paint, fixing everything up. He doesn't need to look out the window to see an American flag waving, but he does.
Yes.
And like I said, on the soundtrack, you hear about, violent new founding fathers of America supporters, burning cars, breaking windows, looting, blah, blah, blah. And then you end with "I'm Afraid of Americans" on the soundtrack. Like, it's saying something very specific.
Well, part of it is, I mean, I was asking, is it doing that American sort of like liberal nationalism narrative? Mind you, or just to be clear, we're recording this on the 9th of November. So that's sort of where we are with the timeline of election stuff. When this comes out, who knows what will have happened. So far, right-wing street power has not been particularly decisive in any particular way, but the election season is not young, but not quite over.
Right.
Well, you know what? We should talk about our views on what's going on right now. But at the same time, when you juxtapose that image of sort of a sort of liberal nationalist imagery with then the not actually defeated but still resistant sort of right-wing, xenophobic, pro-purge violence. Wow, is this stuff really too on point 4 years ago and now is actually life?
Yeah.
The question I guess I have is that in juxtaposing those two at the end of the film, are they critiquing the liberal nationalism, or are they going with it, or is it not clear?
I think it's not clear, because what you also have going here is a certain specific kind of film language when you're 3 movies into a series that's profitable and probably needs to keep going. So I think it's kind of brilliant storytelling to wrap it up this way, because even like Lainey pops in, she's like, "Oh, any news?" And it was like, it's the election day. Like you would be getting notifications. This is 2040. She walks in and he's watching, a tube television, getting, election results that, Charlie has won, and therefore the purge is going to end. But I think I guess maybe it's a mixed bag, because like I think they're politically aware of what they're doing to a certain extent in this film with the narrative. So they're saying like there's the hope. There's like the hope for a better America. In this particular fictional universe, all you have to do is get rid of one night and then, okay, problem solved, whatever. But what you get then, I think what the end is hinting at is that all that stuff is definitely there. I think that what you mentioned, Isaac. So that's what I'm saying. It's kind of a mixed bag and also maybe mixed messages. But what it's also saying is that if you get rid of the purge, which is presumably what's happening in this particular movie, the next movie is going to be about every day is the purge then, because they're breaking windows, they're looting, they're attacking police officers, they're burning cars. That's reserved for the purge night previously in this fictional universe. So you can't do that other times of the year. Like, crime is virtually non-existent and the unemployment rate's down to 1% or less in this like utopian fictional universe. So now you get the purge all the time.
Well, I mean,
versus one night a year, presumably within this universe.
See, if they went in that direction, that would then be saying the purge was right.
They could still go in that direction, because the movie they did after this one was just talking about the first purge that happened.
Right. They sort of jumped
not
back.
What happens in 2041.
Right. So part of it is, I mean, I part of it is that if that was the direction it went, that would undercut the entire thrust. But part of it is what's going on there is not that the purge's premise is that our inherent tendency is to do these things. And the way to control crime is to allow you to do it in one night. The movies are basically saying that's not true. What's going on is politically motivated violence for backing an authoritarian regime, which has just been driven out of power primarily because almost all of its members have been murdered the night before, and then it's been so like their political deck is like gone, and then their main leader is openly defeated in an election. So part of it is, I think you could argue, I mean, it's not that the purge's premise is right. It's that just because you win an election doesn't mean that those tendencies go, the political the actually organized political tendencies behind them actually go away.
Yeah.
And I think if you did for the Purge movie exploring that, you'd have to be walking that line, because if you admit that, well, part of the reason crime is going up is because you don't have a purge anymore, then the purge was... Your entire argument about human nature that you've been sort of building up through these movies sort of falls apart.
Yeah. Well, and there's a good chance that like they went back and did the first Purge, the movie, literally the first Purge, as the follow-up to this one, talking about the origin of it for a reason.
Right.
Like you could have kept going with it and explored that, but it'd be like, maybe that's dicey waters to go. I don't know. And then also because I think the way that the movie The Purge, the original one, did, you didn't get the government's perspective on it. Like it just started with this is a thing, which is a great high concept like thriller, by the way.
Right.
I think. I mean, there's some pratfalls that it falls into, but I'm an Ethan Hawke fan. See our previous episode on First Reformed for more evidence of that. And it's not like an amazing film. What we've got here basically is like this series to me is like a Roger Corman level, like an American International Pictures AIP level, kind of exploitation films. Like you have a high concept that's intriguing and does have some political ramifications to it. In this case, like very overtly, different films are successful to varying degrees. Some of the dialogue, most of the dialogue in any of these movies is functional at best.
Right.
And some people, I would argue, like Frank Grillo, Michael T. Williams is decent at it. Marcos, I forget the actor's name off the top of my head. Elizabeth Mitchell's fine. I think the first Purge, the most recent film, is actually the best one. But some actors are better at delivering functional dialogue better than others are. Sometimes it's clunky. I would say like the Candy Brat scene, caricatures. This is not good acting. It's just like, oh, you need to be just like the overprivileged. Like, again, it's a functional character. It's not a great characterization. But I think they hit on certain things the way that Roger Corman movies did, or maybe like Herschel Gordon Lewis to a certain extent, when you do end up having, based on your method of production and working within an exploitation kind of genre, you're going to hit on certain societal topics because like there's a wow factor to it. Like, oh my God, that'd be crazy. It's a high concept idea that eventually as the series went along, as far as the Purge universe goes, they eventually kind of like found really interesting footing that was hinted at in the first few, gets a little bit more overtly political in this one election year. And I think once you get to the first Purge, you've got like an overtly political, like 70s blaxploitation film within the Purge universe, but also made during the Trump era.
I think this is this is incredibly overtly political. I think they're not being subtle about what they think in these films. I do think that Niche is the sort of modern equivalent of your Roger Cormans, but whereas like, let's say the Wild Angels, right, from 66, which is like a bike movie, which we talked about in a previous episode during the 60 series, CR 66 60s episode, is dealing with the society, it is political by default, because it is dealing with societal transformation. This is more consciously and intentionally so. Like, they're doing this from an exploitation perspective, like as in Corman. Of course, he's going to be making movies about bikers because that'll sell. But they're also like, you're at a point where, it's much more consciously political, and there's the room to do that.
Well, I just meant it gets a bit more so because once you get up to the first Purge, like a full half of the movie is looking at it from the government's perspective. Here you get it a little bit with the candidate and the preacher and the new founding fathers, but it's much more focused on the community that's affected by this than the actual government folks. So like you have Marissa Tomei working with the government to conduct this first experiment, and it gets, again, much more functional than actually interesting as far as dialogue and characters go. But it's the more that the political characters become front and center in the series, the even more overt it gets, I think, by the first Purge.
Right. Yeah. No, you can have. Well, part of it is that the resistance. It's easier to have radical analogs as the resistance than actually what those radical movements would actually be saying. Like, you're not going to have any socialists or communists, open socialists or communists in these films, which is something that, in some ways, it's still where we lag behind, right? We are not actually in American Hollywood films are still not able to are still not going to show actual social movements as they are. It's always going to be by analog. Whereas the leadership, yes, it is by analog, but it's functionally the actual ideology of like a...
Yeah.
They can actually show that openly.
Well, I think that's when we get into the exploitation genre and why it's perfect to explore. I think the exploitation genre can be perfect to explore political ideologies, because in this case, like you said, there's no mention of socialism because like there's no need for that to a certain extent. The only political issue in these movies is, should the Purge exist or not?
Right.
And to go even a step further, they never say Republican or Democrat in specifically an election year, but when you see a voter map at the end, the red is for the Purge folks, the new founding fathers of America, and the blue is for Charlie.
Right.
Which, by the way, in this movie, she wins Ohio, Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Texas. So you do have a red-blue map at the end to kind of tell you like, oh, here's what's really going on, as if you didn't know already if you were paying attention.
Right. Well, and I think, part of it is that, like I was sort of saying with the liberal nationalism, that dulls the bite just a little bit, right? Because it
does.
Well, it's, if we go back all the way back to our original episode on Children of Men and my critique of some liberal viewers, there is always a difficulty for liberals dealing with social movements because they don't get them, really, because they don't get the full extent of them, because they think of themselves at the limit to how far these things go.
Yeah.
I think that these movies have this problem to a much, much lesser degree, but it's funny. It's not funny. It's interesting to find the little cracks there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
But I think to the extent that they actually can do it is the degree to which radical concepts have entered into the mainstream.
Right. I also kind of wonder the evolution of this series, again, since it started with The Purge and we've got up to the first Purge as the only one made during the Trump era. I kind of wonder if the mirror they were holding up to society that is clearly there and very politically interesting in the first one to a certain extent, it's still basically a home invasion thriller movie with some okay to decent gore in it for the fans of the genre. It almost feels like maybe it's more like how the films have evolved from a viewer's perspective based on, because like, again, this movie to me meant something the first time I watched it versus watching it post announcement of this current election results. I was like, oh, wow, this is even more of a parallel than I was really thinking of. I think maybe the mirror is getting more accurate at reflecting what's going on in society. Again, though, through an exploitation lens, not through a clearly defined, here's some political ideologies kind of way.
So you're saying that society is looking more and more like this?
Yes, unfortunately. It feels like it. Like you've got like a religious political cult combo in charge, as we already mentioned previously, with some vague, not even vague, there was some classic authoritarian, if not straight fascist ideology going on. on, going into an election day when the voters could outright just repudiate this whole thing and say no to it. And then who knows what that reaction is going to be from the new founding fathers of America. Now you have an election in America, which there wasn't really an out and out repudiation of, authoritarian and fascism, but did still put forward a victory for let's not do authoritarian and fascism. At least you have election officials that are scared because there are actual bomb threats and threats to their livelihood while they're just trying to do their poorly paid, civic jobs they've got, which are all temp jobs, working, counting the votes. You've got the son of the elected president calling for, quote, total war. And you've got a former top advisor asking for lead scientists and the head of the FBI to be beheaded and placed on the White House lawn.
Yes.
Is that the purge or is that reality? Like, that's fucked up.
That is reality. So let's just talk about how we're dealing with the election so far. Part of what's interesting to me is the degree to which all of that has been so impotent. So we can sort of say what in the run up to this, and you were talking about that presentation we did for the local DSA chapter, which was really prep for a worst case scenario, right? Like street violence, openly the courts being used as a fixing device, so like basically control over the different parts of the state apparatus so that liberal democracy falls apart, which was maybe not the most likely scenario, but a real one. What's interesting is they're doing everything that they said they would do, but if you telegraph it for months, everyone's ready for it. So far, like, yes, they've tried to intimidate the counters and so on, but it's like a few hundred people. And like, ultimately, it has been totally ineffective at actually disrupting the counts. I think a lot of people were looking at sort of like Florida in 2000 and the Brooks Brothers riot, except that works if there's a shock effect. You were saying you were going to do this for months.
Right. Well, also, I think if it was closer,
this would be
it would also probably be a bit more effective.
Right. It would be if there was real ambiguity as to what happened.
Yeah.
But despite the right-wing base that actually believes this stuff, which is admittedly not actually half the country, but pretty close, it's pretty clear it's not. And so part of it is the election. What's interesting, oh God, I can't believe I'm saying this, is at the moment, the institutions are holding. And that was sort of what actually caught me off guard, was the fact that the institutions did hold. Or not totally caught me off guard, but it was like striking because we just didn't know 100% that was what was going to happen. And we've just got 2 months to see if that'll last.
Well, I was going to say, we've already date stamped this, so like that may all change with, I don't know, the next fucking QAnon drop that the president actually just reads from a presidential podium and activates who knows what nut jobs that are out there that are heavily armed, and you get MAGA Bomber 2 or something.
Well, part of what's interesting is that, what the Biden people are doing is in a lot of ways creating facts on the ground by moving ahead as quickly as they can.
Yeah.
It's like you've been like outside of China and Russia, which have their own particular issues. Like most of our major allies who either are too tied to us to say no. So I would actually put, weirdly enough, both the Tory government in Britain and Sisi in Egypt in that camp, where they really would have preferred Trump, but they're not going to not do this,
right?
And then obviously a lot of sort of like center right and center left parties in Europe that desperately needed this to end up the way it did because of their own fears about their own far rights. They're going to immediately recognize that, and it makes it harder and harder to go backwards. And then like the interests of the judiciary, like you don't have a good legal case. You'd have to completely break the judiciary to make this happen. And they're just not willing to do it,
Well, even there was a quote I'd heard from I think it was a judge in Pennsylvania somewhere when they were asking about like, oh, we're not allowed to watch the ballots. And he's like, well, how many Republican poll observers do you have in that building right now? And the lawyer's actual answer was it was a non-zero number of polls. It was like, you can't just like, there's nothing there.
There's nothing there to work with. And despite all the court packing, there is still like the system of liberal democracy is basically as flawed and horrific in many ways as it functions on a regular basis, as illusory as it can be, is holding. And the Supreme Court will see if they get involved, but all the signs are is that they're not interested in doing this with the level of lack of ambiguity there is.
Right.
Well, and Republicans, like the Republican Party, it seems like we're formed up with the congressional Republicans, or most of them at this point, still kind of backing Trump, but actually it's not in their interest to go after any of these votes because they actually gain from them.
I mean, that may be a different story if it was like, the widespread repudiation of this type of politics.
I mean, they'd also be in a harder if there actually had been a blue wave. They'd be in a much more difficult position to do it too. So,
right.
I think structurally Trump is fucked either way. Like he's not in a strong position.
One can dream. Well, no, actually, it's coming true at this point. So.
Yeah, no, I mean the facts on the ground are sort of being created, but we'll have to see if there's a possibility for right-wing mobilization. Meanwhile, the center's first reaction is to attack the left.
Yeah, I was gonna say what, but why don't I feel better like I was told I would?
Because the other thing that's come out of the Trump years is that the nascent mass left that was forming in the Obama years is now an independent thing. It exists, right? Like within our political system, which makes it incredibly difficult for anything, which disorganizes any political forces outside of the two-party system just because of the way the system is structured. So you either have to take them over or not, whereas even though there's vast tensions on both the right and the left to create something independent of these two, right?
Yeah.
Those tensions have finally come to the fore enough on the left, and the organizing and everything has been built enough over the, Bernie, but, there's a lot of things that's been going on for years. I think the Obama years are really like where this sort of starts to take off. But now, there is a left and liberals can't ignore it. So now they have to attack it, even though it's actually really important for them winning.
It's almost one of those, like, whatever you're that upset about or like whatever you're attacking is actually kind of tipping your hand.
Yes. Well,
a little bit.
Yeah. And I say them winning as in giving them some vitality, but of course they have to lose because they have to give up on their material and ideological framework. So,
yeah. All right. Well, before we sign off, we want to let you know what we're watching for the next episode. So if you want to watch along with us, you can. Isaac, what have we got up for next episode?
Well, we're going to continue with the dystopian sort of, playing with fascism and neoliberalism and so forth themes. Where they differ and where they align with a look at two of the most famous films by Paul Verhoeven. No, we're not doing deep dives into the Verhoeven oeuvre, but we are going to look at the first RoboCop from 1987 and 1997's Battleship Troopers, two cult hits that also.
Hold on. It's not Battleship Troopers. It's Starship Troopers.
Starship Troopers. God. And 1997's Starship Troopers, two films which never get old in terms of their political insights, unfortunately.
I didn't realize till you just said that out loud. That's exactly 10 years apart.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that means, but that's interesting to me. I don't know why.
What does it mean?
I don't know. I'll have to take a look at what was going on, politically and the usual research we do for the show and see what was going on and what had changed between 87 and 97. I'm looking forward to that because RoboCop is one of those movies that I watched. The only time I watched it was on VHS back in the day. And it was one of those just like, oh, this rated R action movie. And I remember RoboCop toys. And I think I was just like that kid age because I was born in 77. So I was 10 years old when RoboCop came out. Did not see it in theaters. Saw it a few years later on VHS. And I remember there being toys and the film franchise kept going. Yeah, it definitely caught on in a very interesting way. So I'm curious to go back with adult eyes now to take a look at that.
I remember the toys for those movies. Like when I was a very little kid, I remember the toys for those movies and not really realizing it's such a weird thing to take off. And I think that'll be interesting.
Maybe go back and watch some RoboCop toy ads on YouTube and see what were they really selling to us as kids to play with
right
back then. But well, also before we sign off, be sure to rate and review the show in whatever podcast app you are using. And if you enjoy the show, feel free to tell a friend or three. We also are up on running on Twitter and Instagram and Letterboxd, so follow the links in the show notes if you want to give us a follow on the various socials. So until next time, I'm Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller. And stay safe out there for all of the many reasons.
Most of which we just talked about during the Purge.
Yeah.